Hello, everyone. I'm Michael McNett, Vice President of Education and Marketing with Weedy, and welcome to a Weedy Virtual Spotlight Beyond 0057 Compliance, Translating Mandated APIs into Impact. This event is sponsored by Intersystems. And of course, there's a slight technical issue. There we go. And here's our agenda for today. We open up with Stephen Burko, Senior Advisor, Value-Based Care, Intersystems. Following him, deburdening documentation, removing complexity from DTR implementation with Stefan Rubin with Optum. And our final panel, opportunities to transform electronic prior authorization with artificial intelligence, moderated by Multicare's Anna Taylor and featuring Danny Kaywood from MCG Health, Julie Smith with Intersystems, and Joe Ellis with Optum. It's my pleasure to hand it off to Intersystems' Stephen Burko.
Greetings from Washington, D.C. I wanted to start off with just three thank yous. One, I wanted to thank Weedy for all their help in kind of pulling together this virtual spotlight session. They've been great to work with. Two, I want to thank everybody else who's presenting today and their willingness to step up when we reached out to them, either Russ or Weedy, to help. And I also want to thank everybody on the line. I recognize your time is busy, and I really appreciate the 45 minutes you're going to share with me to dig into what's it going to take to leverage 0057 to scale e-prior authorization, or EPA, and even bigger picture, advanced value-based care. So big thank you to everyone. I actually think that some data published by Gartner last year does a really nice job of kind of framing the challenge that's in front of us. This is actually results from a survey of a panel of health plan leaders that they maintain. And which it's probably a good place to start when you think about the fact that 0057 disproportionately kind of is looking to health plans to make the upfront investments to scale EPA. And on the left, the query was, what was the most important payer initiatives in the year ahead? And you can kind of see the usual suspects, quality improvement, data analytics, risk adjustment. And what's interesting is if you move over to the right and they just tweak the question a little from what are the most important initiatives to what are the most important factors in that decision making, you can see what pops to the top, and regulatory shifts. As a matter of fact, it was the only item that got at least a somewhat important from everyone. And I think this does a nice job of really framing the challenge in front of us. And that is, while we're so busy trying to kind of cross the legal, regulatory T's and dot the regulatory I's and do everything that 0057 mandates, to not lose sight of the fact that our end goal here is not simply regulatory compliance, but advancing those larger aims on the left-hand side. And I think this is particularly challenging when we get into 0057. On this slide, I just this is my cheat sheet that I use, just like, what are all the different things that this regulation mandates? And obviously, this is a dramatic oversimplification of an 1,000-page rule. And keep in mind, it's not just the requirements in the rule, but it's also what the rule highly recommends. And specifically, I just reference the three Da Vinci burden reduction IGs, but obviously there's this whole second overlay of not only do we want to, must we kind of meet the mandates, but ideally we're doing it in a way that follows the roadmap put out there by the three burden reduction IGs. And one of the things that I really kind of like about working with Weedy is, like Intersystems, Weedy works with all stakeholders across healthcare. And you can see on the next slide, this is just a sampling of the customers that Intersystems is working with across North America. So we're working with health plans, we're working with providers, application partners like Epic, and also going over to the right, HIEs and QHINs and whatnot. And as Weedy's executive director, I think likes to say, Rob Tennant likes to say a lot, if we are really going to transform prior authorization pursuant to the roadmap that, in effect, 0057 and the burden reduction IGs are laying out for us, and even bigger picture, ensure that's part of our larger strategy to leverage data to advance value-based care, it's going to take a village. So I think it's helpful that we are bringing all these perspectives to bear because we're not going to get to where we really, really want to go. I'm sure everybody on the line would agree that, in effect, the largest failure wouldn't be not complying, but it would actually be achieving compliance without actually achieving impact. And that very much informs kind of how I want to use my time today. I want to use about the first third of my time talking about kind of what we've learned from the providers that we work with in terms of what's it going to take to scale EPA. And I want to use the second third of my time to talk about the health plan perspective, and the balance of my time to talk about what can we do to ensure that while we're trying to transform EPA, that actually fits into our larger interoperability strategy to advance value-based care. So I actually want to start off with some results from a WEDI DOTS exercise, a root cause exercise that I conducted just a month ago at WEDI Summer Forum. Rob and Michael were kind enough to ask me to come in and conduct with their entire constituency kind of a root cause analysis exercise I've been doing with, kind of constituency specific roundtables earlier in the year. And on the left, you can get a sense of what we did. I came in, I put forward 18 possible barriers to scaling EPA, very much informed by the prior sessions and a lot of input from Rob Tennant. The entire group, we spent about 20 minutes vetting that list, and ultimately we expanded it to 20. And then everybody who was there was asked to indicate what they saw as the top 3 barriers to scaling EPA using high-tech doc stickers. And on the right, you can see the results for the provider participants. By barrier, how many providers selected this as a top barrier to scaling EPA? And, I want to acknowledge up front, this is not a massive N, but I do think that there was one kind of insight from the results that's so demonstrative, it really bears everyone's mind share. And that's, there were only 2 barriers that actually a majority of providers selected as one of their top 3 barriers to scaling EPA. And what's really interesting is when you look at them, neither of them are really technical. Like if you want to find the technical stuff, you have to move over to the right. You're dropping well below a third before you get to siloed systems, needed IT upgrades. And if we come back to what's really getting in the way of us scaling EPA, aversion to changing existing workflows. And I think there was a really healthy dialogue. We spent a lot of time talking about all the things that are wrong and bad about phone and fax for prior authorization, but there was a really healthy dialogue at the Summer Forum about why do so many people migrate to it. And I think what everybody on this line has to keep in mind is there's an inordinate number of people at providers today who are very, very good at making the existing system work. And we're asking them to change a lot of stuff to embrace kind of automated EPA. And I think that's even made a little bit more challenging when you go to the other item that kind of crested that 50% threshold. And there's concerns on the provider side about there's kind of this variable application of the burden reduction IGs, or maybe said in plain speak, you want to get me to get all my people to change their existing workflows for how we do prior auth. And you're asking them to take this leap, and kind of the other shore that they're leaping to is still a bit fuzzy. And I think it's really critical to keep these 2 top barriers top of mind as we roll forward, because providers are not mandated under the regulation to make this leap. So I assume many on the line are familiar with this language. This is the kind of the one provision in 0057 that actually talks about what providers, and it's MIPS eligible for providers, are required to do to, in effect, optimize their reimbursement. And that is simply that they have to do a yes/no attestation if they kind of pursued one prior authorization via EPA. And you can see this is pretty clear. No need to specify a numerator and a denominator. Did I try it at least once during the year? And, kind of CMS has talked about maybe at some point rolling forward, maybe they'll ask for the numerators and denominators, but not now. And I will acknowledge that the recent passage of or finalization of HTI 4 is helpful. And for those unfamiliar with that, just a quick kind of snapshot of the summary sheet from ASTP. What does HTI4, the final rule, do? And it expands the certification criteria for certified health IT to include modules for, in effect, the 3 burden reduction IGs that Da Vinci has put out that collectively are our roadmap for how to automate prior authorization. So CRD, DTR, and prior authorization support. But again, we're not all there yet. We know which way the winds are blowing, everything's aligning, but it is really important that everybody understand that ASTP ONC has not, at least not yet, included these modules in the base definition of an EHR. And what does that mean? It means that these are great in the sense that EHR vendors can go out and get certified on this stuff. It makes really, really clear if you're processing a prior auth through one of those EHR vendors, you can definitely attest yes. But to maximize reimbursement under what are kind of used to be called the meaningful use programs, you don't have to be using an EHR that has met kind of these 3 certification modules yet. Again, ASTP ONC indicating that at some point it will probably be rolled into the base definition EHR. But I think the big takeaway for everybody who's striving to get to impact, to scale EPA, to transform value-based care, is as we think about implementing this technology, we have to keep in mind that we got to be thinking about how do we roll this out in such a way that we're pulling forward the value that not just kind of the leaders on the provider side of IT, but the frontline clinicians and the frontline people who are charged with administering are seeing value. And I think there's some good news. I mean, we've been spending a lot of time as we work with our customers to really think about, wait a minute, we're rolling out this technology. What are the tweaks? What are the things we can do to ensure that from the frontline clinician side, this is a leap they want to make? So I'm just going to share one example. On the screen, kind of you see kind of our kind of diagram for how the CRD workflow is supposed to go pursuant to the CRD IG. Admittedly, we've stylized it. And if you go down to kind of the bottom, you see that there's one huge point of value. We've talked about a lot of the industry. We've had a lot of proofs of concept, and that is there's an inordinate amount of prior authorization requests that the quick answer is there's no prior auth required, or even it can be auto approved. And so we can dramatically minimize the amount of work that a provider has to do, and actually a plan has to do, because there's no point in doing the full submission because no prior authorization is required. But one of the things that we're seeing with kind of the customers we're working with is in many places, this isn't getting the bull rush of everybody kind of saying, yes, 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 we want to make this leap with you. So one of the things that we've started talking about is, well, what are the other opportunities in the CRD process to make this worth the frontline clinicians' while? And one of the things we've noted is that there's this opportunity to use the card that comes back to provide more information up front to the providers. And so you can see kind of a mock-up of one of the things that we were working with the customer. And we were talking about, hey, you could say, hey, this might have already been done. There's a potential duplicate. And one of the things that plan kept hearing from their providers is what would be really helpful is to get an understanding of upfront, if prior authorization is required, are there any tests we can do? Was there any information we can get from that patient before they leave their office? And that, we have like a 15-minute window to do that, but can you tell us that upfront? So just one example, but something to keep in mind as you're rolling out these technologies, constantly talking with providers about what are the tweaks we can make so we can pull forward value to you. Now, if people want to go kind of greater in depth in terms of the specifics of the rules and impacted workflows, I'm going to kind of take a cheat here and just refer you to the big white paper that we put out a while ago. If people haven't downloaded it recently, no, we actually just updated it for 2025. But in light of time, I want to push on to the plan perspective. And again, what I've got here is more results from the WEDI Summer Forum DOTS exercise. And here we're just looking at the percentage of health plan participants rating kind of the name barrier among their top 3. And some things different, some things the same with providers. I think one of the big things that it's more diverse in terms of how health plans or leaders of different health plans see the barriers. Not one barrier actually crested the 50% threshold among people participating in the summer forum. And as a matter of fact, I think in many ways, what's most interesting is not what garnered a lot of dots, but some of the things that garnered very, very few dots. So if you go all the way over to the right, downward margin pressure constraining capital budgets. This was a big issue kind of when this all starts, when people started to wrap their heads around this is going to take a significant investment, both in tech and in workflow change. And increasingly, what was represented at WEDI and is also being represented elsewhere is a recognition that this is a priority for health plans and that it's going to be above the line in terms of needed capital investment. Same thing for market regulatory uncertainty. Providers kind of saying, wait, are payers really going to do this? There's still so much ambiguity out there. And even if you kind of tick one in and you notice the line breaks, so I can't remember, I think low utilization of interop precursors at around 20% was kind of a middling barrier. But again, you're seeing this kind of increasing thing where health plan leaders are saying, we are going to do this. We're not worried about the fact that some of the other things we try to do on interoperability didn't get the uptake we were looking for. We're not worried that there's certain things that still need to be kind of sussed out in terms of how the regulations are going to flow. We're going to find the money. So I think that's really good news for with the providers increasingly realizing that payers are really kind of pretty committed to moving forward here. Now, come back to the left, let's look at some of the things that, although they didn't crest above the 50% mark, were the barriers that garnered the most concern among the plan participants this summer, or last month, actually. And you can see there is a repeat of one, aversion to changing existing workflows. And everybody on the line should be aware that it was really interesting when we delved into this in subsequent discussion, because this aversion, part of the concern that health plans were registering was how much providers would have to change their workflow. Going back to what we just talked about, is there going to be enough upfront value here for providers that they're willing to make this leap? But also they talked about the challenges they had of getting their own peers in other departments impacting prior authorization, that they were going to have to change their workflows. And that actually makes some sense when you look at kind of what surrounds aversion to changing existing workflows, concern over, again, how siloed our systems are, how many different data formats are out there. And how much of this is going to have to be automated to actually get kind of the return that's needed to scale EPA. And so one of the things we've been doing is we've increasingly been putting this slide in front of organizations that we're working with, because I think if we're going to scale EPA, what plans are realizing is they have to figure out, for lack of a better word, how to kind of play this game board. So let me orient it to you. So that gray column in the middle, the CMS mandated APIs, those are the APIs that 0057 mandates a plan must support. For us, that gray box is called payer services. If you're looking on our site for kind of the product that corresponds with the mandated APIs. By the way, we also include CDEX in it. But if we're going to get beyond compliance, if we're going to really get scale, we're going to get the broad utilizations and efficiencies that we're looking for, we're going to have to figure out how to move to the left and how to move to the right. So on the left is this healthy conversation now going on about how are we going to do multi-point connections. And what I've tried to kind of indicate here, there's kind of three kind of options that are out there. So obviously we have the existing portals, and we know that that is very much, portalitis, what providers want to move away from. So what are the options for how to move away from it? We have a growing number of entities trying to figure out how to do this via direct or native functionality. And sometimes that's the EHR, building it into their EHR. So every EHR can connect with a plan. Every provider who is using that EHR can connect with a plan. Likewise, we have at least a number of providers who are actually saying, let us build the connections from the provider side. And, we're supporting both of that. Obviously, we work with a lot of providers. Obviously, we're the technology that underpins Epic. So we're involved in those efforts. But one of the efforts where we're really encouraging people to push on is how to create hubs. And for us, that's manifesting, for example, in terms of we're working with the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association to power their interoperability hub. We're also working with eHealth Solutions to power their proxy apps for supporting hubs. So I think we're at a point where we're not yet, hey, a provider or a plan can join one hub and access everyone. But I do think the good news is we are quickly approaching a world where maybe a plan can choose maybe 2 or 3 hubs or relationships and get at least from one to everyone via 2 or 3 connection points, as opposed to having to go point to point. Then we go over on the other side, and this is, I think, what was alluded to in those results. If you go to the far right, yes, as everybody on this line knows, there is a tremendous amount of processes and systems in the plan back office that have to be tapped to process a prior authorization request. And again, if we're really trying to scale this, we really need to uncork the efficiency of automation. And so we have to figure out how to automate those connections between those APIs and all those back office systems and processes. And you'll note that I've put a purple box in the middle there because I think increasingly there's entities out there who are saying, let us bundle some of this for you. We have a system that we can help you manage all this plan. I know my colleague Michael Lunzer has talked about how Itility can help here. My colleague Stefan from Interqual, I think he's going to talk more about this following me. But the one area where Intersystems gets involved is obviously, outside of payer services. We have a very powerful API manager. We have a very powerful transformation engine. But as we sit down, we are spending a lot of time with customers really mapping out how to make these connections, because it just seems no matter how many things are involved, there's more mapping that's required. So I think if we're going to scale this, we got to get automation. So I really encourage everybody on the line to really spend some time mapping out kind of those connection points and being sure that you have a powerful API manager that can apply the business rules necessary. So this is fully automated. So I'm going to pull up there on the right, because as I alluded to, I think Stefan's going to go deeper in terms of options, in terms of how you automate and streamline kind of these connections between the APIs and the medical rules. And then, of course, we have a final whole conversation on how AI might be able to help us here. However, before leaving plans, I did want to share just some of what I like to call the no regrets moves, some of the emerging best practices we're seeing from our plan customers in terms of how to scale API. I think I got 6 of them, and I think I got enough time to run through them. So the first is expand your mapping of current PA processes to include impacted systems and people and common workarounds. So a lot of organizations we go into, obviously, we're spending a lot of time figuring out how this is supposed to look fully automated. But we really think it's good practice, or what we've seen is it's really good practice to actually say, wait, how does this currently look? And there's 2 reasons for that. One is if you map out the current process, it really can help you find kind of things you might have missed in terms of like, why does your PA process kind of go down a rabbit hole? And I think the second one's even just as important. And like goes back to kind of what we talked about, this barrier that keeps popping up, which is this aversion to changing, your current workflow. And it's going to be really, really helpful if when you're, if IT is going to other groups and departments and saying, look how this is better for you, to actually say, we understand this is a real problem for you. This is a real pinch point for you. Look how this process will address it. Next one, keep what's required versus recommended by CMS 0057 top of mind when staging rollout of EPA. 1127 is now getting really, really close in light of everything that has to be done just to comply with the baseline mandated requirements of the rule. And one thing that the providers this summer said, the summer last month, kept reminding everybody else in the room that you're only going to have limited bites of the apple before providers form kind of a perception of, hey, is this process working for me or not? And one of the things that was underscored was it's really, really important that you deliver on what you promise. So one of the things that we keep working with people is what's the right glide path? We want to ensure that we're promising enough on 1/2/27 that it's going to provide value to those providers, but we're not becoming so aggressive that we overpromise and then providers get on and start doing this and we underperform. Number 3, invest in a high performance API manager and data integration engine. I think, see last slide, data integration engine, just keep in mind that a lot of those backend systems don't speak FHIR, or they speak a different dialect of FHIR. So if we're going to connect them automatically, we have to figure out a way to transform their formats often. Number 4, focus first on leveraging your 80/20s to capture efficiencies from digitization of medical policies to plan provider communication flows. This is almost a corollary of the second point. But with every group that we sit down with, once we kind of have the discussion of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, there's an inordinate number of 80/20s in terms of, hey, if we do this first, this is going to be good enough to get people to want to engage, and then we'll do more down the line. it's going to help with that glide path. The one thing that I encourage people here is it just seems that so many people in interoperability, we want to go after the toughest problems first. And when you're looking for your 80/20s, obviously you want to look at, what are the most prevalent prior auth requests, and be sure you're addressing those first. But you also want to think about what's harder and easier to do, which I think sometimes we always want to go after the hard stuff first. And again, the most important thing is what we do work well out of the gate. So this might be a time to actually look for those things that we can ensure that we can automate well first. 5, apply proven tenets of change management, meet key stakeholders where they're at, and rely on trusted influencers to bring their peers along. Again, getting back to Rob's point about it takes a village. When we're setting those 80/20s, we want to be sure that we're not overbuilding things that the system that has to reply can't handle. The poster child here is how much do we want to do on CQL with regard to DTR. We want to be sure that we're not over-investing up front in building out all these things that the EHR can respond to automatically, unless we've confirmed that the EHR that we're going to be sending those DTR questionnaires to can actually fill those things in via CQL. And then the final one is ensure you don't have to ask providers repeatedly for clinical information previously shared. And this actually is a nice segue to my third section on thinking about how does our efforts to scale EPA fit into what is hopefully our larger data strategy to leverage interoperability to advance value-based care. So to illustrate my point, I just want to put those APIs that 0057 mandates in larger contexts. And specifically, I want to focus on prior authorization and now expand it to payer. So, one of the things that is holding us back is, everybody knows that if we're really going to get where we need to go in terms of a true interoperability strategy, we need to really open up that bi-directional flow of information between plans and providers. And historically, that's been a bit of a flashpoint, right? And, some of us are struggling to kind of open up that bi-directional flow of information. And I think what everybody has to realize is that 0057 is a real push for that bi-directional flow of information. So yes, there's certain things that the plan has to be sharing under the access and payer-to-payer APIs, but I think people also have to realize that the way that the regulation works, plans are increasingly going to be getting information, clinical information, as attachments for prior authorization requests, and then obviously via payer-to-payer. Not only is the plan sometimes going to be the respondent, they're going to be the requester, a great opportunity for that plan to get needed information up front, if appropriately curated, that is going to enable them to plug early gaps in care. And this really begs the question of where are you going to put that information? Because just take payer-to-payer for a second. It's great you're getting that information, but the ultimate ambition is it's up on the second bullet top left, ensure continuation of treatment regimens when somebody's enrolled in a new plan. But if that information is coming in and it's just sitting, it has to be put somewhere that it can be leveraged to do this. So what I've done on the next slide is I have included a starter scorecard that my colleague Jess Jowdy and I have pulled together to help people think through what are the real capabilities that you need in an LHR, longitudinal health record. And the reason why we did this is I think we could have a big conversation around semantics. What's the difference between a data mart and a data lake and a true LHR and a FHIR repository? But I think to simplify it, we found it was easier to sit down with plans and providers and talk about if we're really going to get to this future where we're leveraging data and interoperability to advance value-based care, what are the capabilities that we need in that LHR? I am going to top line this. My understanding is these slides will be shared. I really do encourage people to dog ear this slide and start using it. We use it. Our LHR product is called Unified Care Record, or UCR, and we hold ourselves accountable to be able to be sure that our UCR does all these things. So starting on the left, I just use kind of ETL, kind of a framework everyone's familiar with. But I think it's important to recognize that, yes, what we all know, even though we're all aspiring to move to FHIR, the lion's share of the data that's coming in isn't in FHIR, or even if it's in a FHIR resource, if you open that resource, there's a pile of other stuff inside. So you've got to be able to ingest in a wide range of formats. But it's not just formats. You also have to ingest versus different protocols, how that stuff is coming in, push, pull, obviously single or bulk is becoming increasingly important. And the other thing that we think is really important, if we're going to get to impact, is you really want to try to pull forward the evaluation of, is the data you're getting missing any key element? Is there one data element that if you're missing it, it's really going to undermine the utility of all the other data? Much better to identify that up front, to get that into your data feed, as opposed to kind of on the back and realizing, whoops, I'm missing a key piece of information that is really undermining the utility of what I've put into my LHR. All the information comes in. Obviously, when you're looking at LHR, you want to be sure that you can transform the data, parse, index, deduplicate, probably terminology everybody's familiar with. I do think we need to start educating people within our organizations. What is the difference between harmonization and normalization? I think all too often these terms become conflated. I think it's important that people begin to recognize that even if something's in a common format, it can speak different dialects of that common format, and it has to be harmonized for it to be able to truly be able to talk to each other. Moving over to the far right, we really get into a place to put this. And I think your data model is really important. Once you've parsed it, you want to be sure you have a place to put each element. And this is really critical. All too often, what we see is people grabbing data for a single purpose. And no matter how much they tell us how hard it is to get providers to share their clinical data with the plan, too much gets left on the cutting room floor, either because they're only thinking about an immediate purpose or they have no place to put it. So you want to be sure that you're grabbing all the data and you have a place to put it, not just for the immediate purpose, but for other possible use cases. And then I've got 3 bullets here, all about what I like to call making this data readily available for use. So think macro use cases. You've got to be sure it's in relational tables so it can readily fuel your population health analytics. Think micro applications. You're going to be sure that it has those no or low code tools to author the business rules, right? So you can have those alerts fire to help close care gaps with individual members or patients. And then ideally, like ours, we have a clinical viewer, so you can go in there and you can actually see everything. But ultimately, if we're really going to get to advancing value-based care, we have to be sure that LHR can readily pump the information into the APIs and the applications and the software that our care managers are already using. Again, to the extent possible, we want the data to be pumped into their existing work stream, not asking them to change their work stream. And then down at the bottom, I'm going to go fast, but these are really important. Said simply, you have to be able to do all this stuff. And if it's really going to be the future we're going to, we want to be sure that when we start to get the volumes and we start to get the scale that we want, we have no erosion in speed. And of course, everything has to be, it's healthcare, everything has to be secure, especially as we increasingly flow clinical information into the LHR. Again, I hope people dog ear this page. I'm just going to close with two more slides, which I think underscore why I keep encouraging people to dog ear this page. Just one example here. And this is going back to payer, and it kind of repeats the challenge that I opened up with regard to EPA. I mean, this is just kind of my summary of all the kind of operational mandates that flow from 0057. And again, you can see how easy it can become to become consumed with making sure you're doing every one of these things. But the challenge is, as a number of health plans have now pointed out to me, is we can do all this stuff and all you're going to get is compliance. Because the problem is, so great, now you're getting all this information from another plan, but it's coming all too often in a fire bundle. And if you open it up, it's a pile of stuff. And that has to be transformed and made readily available for use. If our care managers and our population health analysts are going to deploy that to advance value-based care. And just one more slide. I know we're going to have a full hour on leveraging AI, but I think it's really, really important that everybody also keep top of mind that clean, healthy, parsed data is the fuel that AI or big data analytics requires to do what it promises to do. And this is just one of many you can find academic articles. This is from Informatech Target, which is an outfit that actually is intended to inform buyers of tech and actually investors in technology companies. And it's just one of many kind of reports, observations, leading insights that again and again score that although everybody wants to talk about AI, that when you pull back the curtain and you really get into it, AI is only going to be as good as the clean, healthy data that we pour into it. And that is the bigger challenge, that all too often, when people actually roll up their sleeves and start working on AI projects, they tell us that they have to spend 80–90% of the time actually just getting the clean, healthy data needed to pour into the AI solution. Otherwise, they are going to fall prey to drift and hallucination. So again, that's all the remarks I have today. Obviously, we really want to help everyone in terms of not just getting to compliance, but actually getting to scale on EPA and really leveraging the clinical data that's now starting to get a bi-directional flow to advance value-based care. Eager to talk to anybody who is equally passionate about it. And with that, I think, Michael, I'm going to hand it to you. I don't know if we have time for questions or I've used all my time and you want to move on to Stefan.
Nope. We do have time for questions. Please enter them in the chat window if you can. Stephen, once again, as always, a fantastic presentation. Thank you to you. Thank you, and thank you to Intersystems, our sponsor. We'll allow a couple of seconds for folks to populate the chat box if you do have a question. And Stephen will be here throughout the time of the spotlight. So if the question pops up at a later time today, feel free to enter it, and I'm sure Stephen will address it in the chat for you.
So I just have Michael in shock that I actually kept to my time religiously.
You were nice and tight. I like it. I like it. All right. Well, allow me. Doesn't look like any questions are popping up yet. But once again, as I said, if you do have questions, feel free to enter them in the chat, and Stephen will get to them. It's my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, from Stephen to Stefan, deburdening documentation, removing complexity from DTR implementation. It's my pleasure to introduce Stefan Rubin, Director of Product Management, Optum Insights with Optum.
Great. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Stephen, and thank you to Intersystems for sponsoring this webinar, and thanks to all of you for being here. I forgot when Stephen asked me if I would be interested in sharing some thoughts with all of you today, that it meant I would probably have to follow him in presentation, and that's a little bit like trying to follow AC/DC as far as just like pure volume of rock and information. Um, Let me pull up my slides. Everyone always knows slide transitions famously go well when you have multi-speaker webinars. Michael, I think I'll look to you. Can
You're
I get
good
a
to
screen
go.
share check? Yep, great. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to do a quick, am I still sharing?
Yes, you are.
Great. Okay, I got my notes on another screen. Yeah, so like I said, thank you everyone. Really great to be here with you all. Really excited to chat with you all about deburdening and removing complexity from the documentation requirements and DTR implementation part of DaVinci specifically. Um, just a little bit about me and who I am and why I'm up here. So my name is Stefan Rubin. Always great to follow a Steven to help reduce ambiguity and how to correctly pronounce my name. But I'm Stefan Rubin, and I'm a director of product management on the clinical decision support team at Optum, specifically within the Optum Insight Group. I've been in the health IT field for pretty much my entire career, over 15 years now. Got my start as an engineer. Actually, my background is as a technologist and an engineer. Started out working in the HL7 salt mines at Boston Children's Hospital. Spent some time working on HIEs and health information exchanges when that was where the government compliance and regulatory and money fire hose buzz was, and have been in product for the last kind of 9 or so years, almost exclusively working in integration and interoperability. And so I'm here within the interqual business at Optum, focusing on prior auth automation using interqual criteria, and in particular, making the criteria and the workflows interoperable. Um, so I have three main kind of beats I'm going to hit today. I'm going to talk a little bit about three sources of complexity that our business has identified in DTR implementation. Three, we could only pick three. I could probably spend the entire 2+ hour window of time that we have today talking about several other sources of complexity in implementing DTR, but we limited it to three. I'll talk a little bit about some strategies to address some of these complexities and things to keep in mind as you think about, again, like wicking away that complexity and removing some of that burden. And then we'll talk about an action plan. And I'm going to try to keep it really straightforward, really basic, just kind of a handful of steps that you can do week in, week out, no big grand things of just like checking in with your team's basic stuff on developing action plans, because ultimately this is going to be a thing that I think my colleague Mike Lunzer at Itility Health likes to say that we'll either win together as an industry or we'll lose together as an industry. And I think some of Stephen's remarks really kind of bring that home. I will tell you that each of these sources of complexity that we identified, we discussed these complexity sources and these areas of risks in these hornets nest months ago, but I can tell you, having spent time in market and in industry talking to payers week in and week out, every single one of these has come up in the last week, which has been vindicating for me, sort of saying, oh, well, we really picked something that's top of mind and becoming more salient. But I think at the same time, it also kind of underscores just how pervasive these are and just how costly and challenging they can be if we don't successfully address them and we don't tackle them head on. So the first of the three is this, what I like to call multiple policies, multiple locations. And since I'm a former engineer, the analogy that I like to use is, we need version control for medical policy, and I don't mean version control in the sense of like track changes. I mean version control in the sense of like infrastructure to manage the corpus of information that we have. Again, for the techies out there, you might remember the move from SVN to Git when we moved from centralized to decentralized. Version control and management. And I feel like the time has come for a similar evaluation or reconsideration of medical policy as an asset that we need to manage, because interoperability kind of pushes or gives us the ability to push medical policy and clinical rules towards that kind of technical way of thinking about organizing and managing and serializing information. The middle driver of complexity is what I'm calling prior auth across the care continuum. And really what this means is non-ambulatory prior auth. Are our solutions and our strategies and our architectures sufficiently capable of handling post-acute prior auth scenarios for a prior auth involving dual eligibles, involving complex cases, and then what I like to call non-transactional use cases. So a group that I've spent a good amount of time talking to recently is the HL7 Codex work group, which is focusing on medication oncology and radiation oncology. And the thing that they always kind of emphasize and make a point to bring up when we talk about Da Vinci 0057 and interoperability is that their prior auth use case scenarios are not nearly as um, we'll call them transactional as something like, say, a knee replacement or a DME order for a CPAP machine. They tend to happen much more rapidly. They tend to be a lot more sort of conversational, as the case may be, between the plan, the provider, and then, of course, the patient. How is the patient responding this week to their treatment? How is the patient experiencing their side effects this week? The medications and the interventions are adjusted with a high degree of frequency. And so the prior auth infrastructure needs to support and reflect that. And then the third driver of complexity is something that Stephen talked about a little bit in his remarks, and it's something that's I'm really passionate about, which is provider adoption. We did a session on this at the Weedy Summer Forum, and I'll share some remarks from that in a little bit. But ultimately, all of this will be for naught if we can't together as an industry build something that well and truly gives the fax machine a run for its money. These provider communities need to feel like what we're bringing to them represents a meaningful improvement over the status quo and materially impacts the way they spend their hours in the day and the way their patients experience the healthcare system, right? The doctor is the ambassador of the healthcare system to the patient in many cases. And so we have an obligation to build something that actually improves upon what's out there today and equip those providers to give their patients, our patients, us, all of us as patients, an improved and compelling experience beyond simply fill out this questionnaire and I'll fax it to your plan. And hopefully in 5 days, we'll find out if you can get the drug you need or the surgery you need or, the DME that you need. So let's tackle this first complexity driver of kind of multiple policies, multiple locations. So, I talked a little bit about this earlier, and Stephen touched upon it in his remarks, which is that anytime we have variability in a system, we introduce the potential for standards to be interpreted in different ways. We introduce complexity, we introduce risk. And so all of these add up to barriers to adoption, right? Above a certain threshold, the complexity of a system becomes kind of either impossible to reconcile or so hard to reconcile that people just don't do the work. And so the experience isn't an improvement, it's not seamless, and people just go back to what they know, right? We are all creatures of habits, and providers are not exceptions. So the way I like to think about this, I mentioned version control, but I'm going to use Stephen's analogy of data because I think it's a little bit more relevant and a little bit more germane, which is that, interoperability gives us the ability to turn our medical policy into data. And so we should develop processes to manage that policy similar to the way we would develop processes and infrastructure and structure to manage our data. So whether it's about environments in which it lives, how it's normalized, how it's deployed and published and managed across different environments and different modalities, if our medical policy involves the evaluation of rules or the use of artificial intelligence, which we'll of course talk about in a little bit, right? What is the quality of what's getting fed into that? And so thinking about how we manage medical policy the same way we manage data, I think is like really, really important and potentially an idea whose time has come. I think as a corollary to that, as we think about AI, we're in a really good place and we have a really good start, but, fully touchless prior auth is probably something that we want to approach carefully. I'll tell you two anecdotes from the last week to kind of underscore what I mean here. One is I was having dinner with a nurse staffer who supports a number of radiation oncologists. She works at Mass General Brigham in Boston, where I live. And she was telling me that she knows that her attendings, when they get denials, they're just using ChatGPT to generate their, appeal letters. And I said to her, I said, well, what rationale do they cite? Like, how do they handle the evidence-based part of it? And she was like, I don't know. I don't think they do. They just put it in a ChatGPT and then they send it over. And if it gets denied, they do it again. And I was like, oh, that's kind of shocking. And then I was meeting with a health plan just this week, not that long ago. And we were talking to the health plan about how they handle their denial letters. And they're like, we have an increase in denial letters. And so we started using ChatGPT to write our denial letters. And I was like, oh, well, how are you handling the evidence-based piece of kind of your denial letters? And they were like, they didn't really have the most satisfying answer for me. It was kind of surprising, actually. So I think we're in this world where it's not out of the question that the future looks a lot like robots talking to robots or chat models talking to chat models. And, I think we all hope that the humanity doesn't get completely sucked out of healthcare, but there's probably going to be some amount of, chatbots talking to chatbots. And so if that is going to be a part of our future, I think it's really, really important that we build and train and deliver all of that on a solid empirical foundation of evidence-based medical policy and clinical rules that are clearly articulated, clearly defined, and clearly managed to just reduce the likelihood of all of the challenging outcomes that can become possible when we start talking about AI. And I'm sure our panelists, will get into all the ways that this can go right and all the ways that it can go not so right. The way I like to, the kind of turn of phrase I like to use is clean criteria. We talk a lot about clean data. I think we should pay equal attention to clean criteria. How will we make sure that the criteria that we're using is as clean as the data that we're using? And then, when we talk about medical policy and managing it across environments, I think just asking whether environments can be flattened or consolidated or things like that. Can medical policy be merged if there are two policies that are sufficiently similar? If an industry standard policy is 80% of the way to a custom policy that we have, is there a way to reconcile or merge those two or customize the standard policy to align with the custom policy, whether it's a state policy, standard policy, Medicaid policy, something like that. Okay, let's talk about our second complexity driver, which is prior auths across the continuum of care. So there are interoperability solutions out there for ambulatory use cases and care settings. We have custom policies. There are several vendors out there that are working primarily off of the Medicare NCDs and LCDs. But what we're finding with the health plans that we talk to is that, often transitions of care and discharge planning and kind of post-acute can be handled by different teams with different needs. And in many cases on the provider side, it is a different case because these are inpatients who are moving to a subacute level of care that may or may not require multiple orchestrated prior auths done in concert or collaboration with your typical ambulatory prior auth of, additional surgeries, DME, follow-up imaging studies, stuff like that. But a key kind of gap that we've identified is that while Medicare NCDs and LCDs are pretty, robust and are widely available, many of the post-acute services that health plans build auth strategies around don't have Medicare NCDs or LCDs. And so, to the degree that there is publicly available universal medical policy, these areas of care, there might not be that critical mass of kind of government published policy to sort of base decisions on, to train models on, to build products around. But post-acute prior auths are in scope for CMS 0057. Our business is approaching the post-acute area with as much rigor and scrutiny as we are the ambulatory and the imaging areas. And I think this is important because it's also an area where a really sound prior auth strategy can impact metrics and KPIs beyond the ones that you might traditionally associate with a prior auth transformation regimen, things like turnaround times and, what is our denial rate and things like that. A really savvy prior auth automation strategy that takes your post-acute and transitions of care and discharge planning scenarios into account can help you impact things like post-acute utilization, readmission rates, member satisfaction. If you can get a member home quicker, you can get a member to the appropriate level of care more quickly. At Optum Interqual, what we do is we've digitized our entire corpus of policy and sort of made it interoperable through DTR APIs. But an additional thing that we've done to sort of help with the compliance piece of this is the Interqual post-acute suite includes references to and aligns with all of the chapters in the Medicare policy manual. So as your providers are interacting with interqual criteria that is delivered digitally through DTR or is made interoperable through Digital Criteria Hub, which is our interoperability offering. They are also getting the kind of Medicare policy manual chapter guidance that sort of lets them align the standard to what Medicare publishes, even though it's not in an NCD or an LCD. So we are sort of trying to heed our own lessons and simplify and consolidate how we represent and publish medical policy, the same way we're encouraging all of you to do. So the third source of complexity is around provider adoption. And provider adoption, we talked about this at the WEDI Summer Forum in the panel that I participated in with Julie from Intersystems and Celine from the American Medical Association, Terry from the American Hospital Association, and Greg LeGros from Athena Health, kind of trying to understand that provider experience. And they said, all of them in their own ways, and Stephen's, emphasized it, is provider adoption is going to be crucial here. And a thing that really stuck with me from my time on that panel was a remark made by Terry from the AHA, where he essentially was like, the AHA is kind of proceeding really carefully here with engaging the provider community around interoperability in CMS 0057, because we really want to make sure the first experiences that our community has are good ones. And as an interop vendor, as a policy vendor, I really took that to heart, and I thought that was really important because, as we like to say, and we constantly remind ourselves, prior auth is a conversation, right? It's a conversation between the provider and the payer about what care is appropriate for this member. And so I think we can't build software and ship products that enable and facilitate these kind of seamless, ideally pleasant conversations if we don't kind of have those conversations in advance of shipping the product, right? And so the sort of guidance that we give here is to encourage our health plans to work with partners who have deep connections in the provider community, because this can help you not just set good expectations, but also help you as a plan make sure that what your vendor or what your partners are going to bring to market is going to meet your provider community where it is, and where they are and what their needs are. And then sort of as a corollary to that is, don't wait for someone else to help bring that conversation about, whether it's, a sort of evidence-based criteria vendor like Interqual, whether it's an industry advocacy group like the American Medical Association or AHIP, engage your provider communities directly, and build that empathy with them. I think one of the major reasons prior auth is so frowned upon is because it's supposed to be a process and a workflow that is predicated on trust. And a lot of that trust has been kind of chipped away and eroded and sullied in the industry. We just don't have the trust that we used to have. And so, the process just ends up being a broken process. And so we encourage all of our health plans to engage their provider communities, work with vendors who have good relationships with the provider community, and don't wait. Engage them sooner rather than later. Ask questions. Don't wait for, contracts to come up or new employers to get signed. Because CMS 0057 makes no obligations of providers, adoption won't necessarily follow implementation, right? Stephen talked about this in his remarks, but HTI-4 will require those vendors to certify, but I don't think any of us should hold the expectation that that alone will be sufficient to do things like build trust, build empathy, or even deliver that, polished, improved, enhanced experience that Terry was talking about and that we all know is really going to be what's needed here if we're going to, like I said earlier, give that fax machine a run for its money. Okay, so let's talk about kind of concrete steps we can take. And again, like I said, I really wanted to keep this high level, but consolidate policy silos where possible. I think siloed information is a thing that gets talked about a lot when we talk about interoperability and prior auth and data. But again, my assertion is that this should be applied equally to the medical policies and the evidence-based criteria and the clinical rules that influence how that data is used. So again, if you have a custom policy that is, sufficiently close to a standard policy, do the work to kind of conduct that gap analysis. Where do we have custom policies? And what is the delta between the policy that our plan uses and some other known fixed point, whether it's from, again, a criteria vendor like Interqual, whether it's a Medicare policy, a state policy, and try to have a conversation amongst clinical professionals about whether the custom policy still needs to exist. And if it does need to exist, digitize it using a product or a tool that will allow you to update and modify and change it over time. And again, ideally try to knock down as many of those silos as you can, even moving from 4 to 3 or 3 to 2. The returns can be pretty immense. But I think conducting that gap analysis is like a really, really good first step, because that can inform where the policy silos might live. Okay, when you're evaluating interoperability solutions across your continuum, give equal attention to those kind of inpatient slash, acute, post-acute prior auth scenarios as you do to the outpatient prior auth scenarios, which we know, there's a litany of information out there on those ambulatory ones. If your plan is structured where post-acute or inpatient is handled in a different wing of the building than the ambulatory and kind of care planning teams, kind of try to bring those teams together, understand where those workflows may diverge, where they may be different, understand what your provider mix looks like, right? Where does a lot of our post-acute or transition of care auth volume come from vis-a-vis a lot of the ambulatory volume, right? If you're in a market with a big integrated health system, maybe this isn't as big a challenge, right? Because they've all sort of consolidated and merged and they're all in the same Uber version of Epic. But if you're in a community where the ambulatory folks are on one EMR or they have one kind of tech stack, but your inpatient intake looks different, pay equal attention to both scenarios. And then think about, again, to the point about policy silos, think about what the ramifications are from a policy perspective. Are there ways to take the things you learn from step 2 here and kind of feed them into step 1, and further consolidate policy silos or further streamline your policy management process. And then, engage your providers. Like I said, the best time to engage them was probably, 6 months to a year ago. But the second best time is today. Listen to them and, create opportunities to listen. Work with your vendors, work with your partners, work with your advocacy groups, work with your community orgs, and build that bridge to the provider community where it doesn't today exist. And really, really listen. I think the providers see this coming. The awareness is starting to come. I wouldn't be surprised if you surveyed 100 of them, if they said 20 of them are just expecting this to be, portals by another name, right? Here's more tech that the payer is going to foist on me that I'm going to have to re-engineer my workflow around. It's going to further erode this trust problem that we have, and maybe we'll have adoption, but we won't have satisfaction, or we won't have the impact that we want. I think if you're bringing other parties to those provider listening sessions, they might pick up on things that you don't, right? So as a vendor, I'm always listening for, how do I think this workflow translates into Fire? How well do I think the Fire resources and workflows that exist today support this workflow that this clinician is talking about? What is the context in which this clinician sort of experiences this, right? What's their payer mix like? Those sorts of things. And then when you're ready, when your infrastructure is ready, bring your providers to the testing party. Conduct thorough testing with them to ensure reliability and ensure understanding. If you bring your providers or representatives from your provider community into the interoperability testing journey, then what comes out the other side won't be a surprise to them. They'll at least have some expectation of it. It'll allow all of us as health plans and as health plan aligned vendors to set expectations. But it'll also allow us to learn and build empathy and build trust. I want to give Danny Kaywood a little bit of a shout out because he said something I think it was AHIP that really stuck with me, which was that you should not just test and then test again, but when you test, you should make a point to share your results. And so I think even if your plan decides that it's just not the right time or circumstance to engage a provider directly in testing, share updates with them, tell them how it's going. Be transparent and let them know where the challenges are. Again, we want to, I think, reduce surprises, but we also want to use this as an opportunity to reset the balance of trust. Because ultimately that's what's going to lead to adoption. That's what's going to lead to impact. I have not had the chat up, so I can't see if there are any questions, but that was my spiel.
Excellent, Stefan. Thank you very much. We do have a couple of questions in the chat.
Sure.
ISIS has, with the notice of action, organizational determination letters, how are you capturing the nuances of the state requirements with the letters?
Okay. Notice of action is a new acronym for me. So I guess ISIS, not to put you on the spot, but are you talking about the requirement in CMS 0057 around needing to cite evidence-based criteria in denial letters? Or ADLs? Yeah, okay. So you're asking about the need to cite evidence in issuing an ADL, an adverse determination letter, wherein a member is notified that a service or a dispensation wasn't covered. So we at Interqual, we handle that through a product called Decision Reasons. The Decision Reasons product is outside the scope of Digital Criteria Hub, which is our interoperability offering. But essentially what the offering allows plans to do is integrate interqual criteria and the evidence-based structure of the criteria into ADLs that they can write. So you can essentially craft a kind of skeleton or a template using interqual criteria as kind of the basis of the letter. And then you can either feed that letter into a template, a template with your plan's letterhead on it. You can feed it into some other letter generation tool you have. Could feed it into an AI that you consider that path carefully, make sure you sort of fully understand what the AI is and isn't capable of there. But yes, we have a sister product to Digital Criteria Hub, whose purpose is directly to address the need to bring evidence-based criteria into the ADL flow.
Excellent. Thank you. Rashani has one. Can the presenter share additional details on how to standardize the medical policies?
Definitely. I will share with you the best answer I can give as an engineer and product person and offer caveats that I'm not a clinician. And so without knowing sort of Rashani's context or background, your question may be better answered by a clinician or a member of our clinical team. So if my answer leads to more questions, I invite you to get in touch with me and we can certainly connect you to someone on our team who can maybe give you a more substantive clinical answer. But in practice, what it really looks like is a gap analysis. And I think the gap analysis has two steps. The first step is evaluating your library of custom medical policies against known repositories of criteria, right? Whether it's proprietary criteria like Interqual or MCG, whether it's government published policies, so Medicare NCDs and LCDs, or depending on your state, if your state has a policy manual that proves relatively durable, right? And the policy manual itself doesn't change that much. Figure out where your custom policies overlap and diverge from the kind of corpus of policy that already exists out there from other vendors and other sources. I think then having done that, sort of the next level down is at the sort of individual policy level or the policy group level. And that's where you sort of take the custom policy that your plan uses and whatever standard other policy exists out there. Let's take a Medicare NCD, for example, right? Saying, okay, the Medicare NCD has these 5 indications, each of which has anywhere between 2 and 5 discrete specific criteria under them. Okay, well, where does our plan's custom policy diverge from that? Do we have more indications or fewer than they do? Are the individual criteria under those indications roughly in line? Do we pick a different benchmark or a different baseline or a different range of normal limits than the standard plan does? And what evidence does our medical team cite for wanting to set that different baseline? So sort of engaging in this kind of Socratic inquiry of going by group, by policy, and then going all the way down to the individual indication, and just sort of saying, okay, our medical directors believe that our plan wants to be covering these in because of variances in our member populations or something like that. And maybe your plan arrives at the conclusion that we do want to keep the custom policy, but at least we've done our work, right? We've looked at what's out there. We've done the gap analysis. So, Roshani, I hope that answered your question. And again, if there are more clinical details we can get into, happy to connect you with someone on our team. I did not pay Stephen to do this, nor did I offer to buy him dinner, but he asks a question about how we're helping plans populate questionnaires for DTR. So I would say we're taking a three-pronged approach here. The first thing we're doing is we are looking at CQL. So we have two teams that are taking different approaches to CQL questionnaire pre-population. One is a team of clinicians and medical technologists who are kind of writing CQL the old-fashioned way by looking at the indication, looking at USCDI and FHIR, and sort of saying, okay, we think this criteria point maps to this resource within these ranges, and sort of writing the criteria points that way. We are also looking at AI-assisted authoring of CQL. Again, this is an area where we want to proceed quite deliberately and quite carefully. We've seen pretty promising early returns, but scaling a program like that needs to be done carefully. So we're sort of evaluating what our next steps are there. So we have two sort of irons in the fire on the CQL front. The other thing that we're looking at is, and Stephen talked about this in his presentation, is figuring out how our health plan customers are building their data aggregation and data warehouse strategies, and then looking at ways those assets and those investments can kind of be leveraged and parlayed into questionnaire pre-population on delivery, right? So when a questionnaire gets delivered into a provider workflow, how can we pre-populate that questionnaire with information that the plan already knows about the member? There's no reason we should have to ask a provider to indicate whether a patient is over or under the age of 18, right? Not only does the EMR know that information, but the plan knows that information, right? If this is a prior auth request for a surgery, the plan likely already has information through claims about what kind of therapies and interventions the member already underwent. So how can we as a criteria vendor, either through CQL or through other FHIR-enabled means, take that asset, that data asset, map it onto the criteria, and then deliver a partially completed questionnaire to a provider and say, this questionnaire has been filled out with stuff your plan already knows. You should probably check it against your understanding of the member, the record that you have, and then, information that you've collected firsthand. But some, non-zero percentage of the burden can be wicked away from the provider before the questionnaire even lands on their doorstep. And then the third
Excellent.
thing that we're doing. Oh, sorry, was there
Oh, no,
another?
go ahead. I thought you were done. Continue, please.
Yep. No, sorry, Michael. The last question I was going to ask was, or the last thing I was going to say is just looking at provider side vendors who are using AI to accelerate the prior auth process on the provider side, and just sort of asking, what opportunities are there to bring AI to the provider auth intake experience?
Excellent. Thank you so much. Are there any additional questions for Stefan? All right, great. Once again, thank you very much.
Thanks,
We
everyone.
appreciate it. And now we are moving on to our closing session, looking at opportunities to transform electronic prior authorization with artificial intelligence. The moderator for this will be Anna Taylor, AVP of Population Health and Value-Based Care with Multicare Connected Care, featuring Danny Kaywood, Senior Manager, Product Management with MCG Health, Julie Smith, Senior Manager, Product Management with Intersystems. And though self-professed limited, we do welcome back Stefan Rubin from Interqual to join. Anna, the microphone is yours. Anna, are you there? What's that song? Tommy, can you hear me? Is that what it is?
I can hear you.
We can hear you.
All right. You guys can hear me. Anna, are you there?
Yep, I'm here. Sorry, I had to go get something really quick.
Okay. Welcome.
Thank you. I'll be on camera shortly here for a second. How is everyone?
Doing well. First presentations were fantastic by Stephen and Stefan, and now I welcome you to carry us through across the goal line. It is football season. And as we talk with Danny, Julie, and Stefan about electronic prior authorization and artificial intelligence, I'll hand the moderator chores to you.
Thank you so much, Michael. I really appreciate that. One thing I would love to do before we get started is if we could go down the panel and have the panel introduce themselves. I don't think we talked about that in our first meeting. So I'm gonna hand the mic off to Julie, and then we can just go down the line.
Great, thanks, Ann. So as Mike mentioned, my name is Julie Smith. I am with Intersystems, and I lead part of the product organization that really focuses on the provider and payer market. And I come from a long clinical background. I'm a nurse by training, and I've been in this field for decades. And so it's really exciting to see providers and payers come together in this way.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. All right. Next on the Hollywood Squares is Stefan, I think.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. I'm Stefan. I'm a director of product management at Optum. I'm the guy who just talked at you for 20-something minutes.
And Danny Kaywood here from MCG, Senior Product Manager, focused on a lot of what we do for prior auth and utilization management, automation, and interoperability. I'm semi-frequently the guy who will talk at you for 20 minutes, but happens to not be today. Lucky you all. Back to you, Anna.
Thanks so much. Is Joe here?
Yeah, so tonight in your program is the part of Joe Ellis will be played by
Oh,
Stephen Rubin, the
will
guy who
be
just
played
talks at
by
everyone for
Stefan.
20
I missed
minutes.
that memo. Thank you so
Yes,
much.
no, the response to the inaugural performance was overwhelming, and so they decided to keep it going.
You're
No, so jokes aside, my colleague Joe had unfortunately a somewhat urgent conflict, so he asked if I could just kind of be here in his stead. So I'll offer a caveat to you, Anna, and my fellow panelists. My expertise is unsurprisingly more on the interop side than the AI side. Joe works on kind of a sister team to me, but him and I are in regular comms. We tackle a lot of the same problems. A lot of these things are universal. So I will contribute as ably as I can, but frankly, you all, I think, are probably a touch closer to the finer points here than I am.
Great. Thanks so much for jumping in. Really appreciate that, Stefan. And I think you're closer than you think you are, because data is the reason why AI.
Yeah, I'm learning that, aren't I? Yeah.
Yeah, you are. You're learning that. All of a
Yep.
sudden, we become very important. So
Yeah.
with that being said, I actually want to kick this conversation off around the foundation and what makes that AI turn into the right answer, the right insight at the right time, at the right place. So it's AI is only as strong as the language model that it is being run on top of. And so what does healthy data look like in the context of EPA? So we're speaking in regards to prior authorization and making that completely electronic today. Some argue that it is electronic. Portals are electronic. I'm like, no, portal. Nope, I beg to differ. So what is that for the panel? What does that context look like for you? What does good, healthy foundation look like to you? So I'm going to start with Julie on this question.
Yeah, so this is really part of where Intersystems shines, right? It's a part of our bread and butter. We've been at this a long time, and so I think our concept of healthy data is really thinking about the comprehensiveness of a record. One, saying not just is it accurate, but do we have a ton of duplication? Do we have a ton of things that need to be normalized? Do we need to harmonize that data? Have we actually traced it back for sourcing and things like that in ways that very often what we've done historically is just dump it into a giant bucket and not really taken a look at it to say, is it usable yet? And I think here's the opportunity to say, we actually have to make it clean. We have to make it usable, because otherwise, when we lay AI on top of it, it's not going to give us the answers we need, right? Because it's not working off a clean playing field. And when it's cluttered with the mess that data is in reality, we can't really move forward and have some confidence and assurance around the accuracy. And so healthy data is foundational. I've heard this, I do a lot of work on the AI space across some of our other industries that we covered. And it doesn't matter what industry it is. If we're talking about finance, if we're talking about healthcare, if we're talking about, space exploration, it all comes down to, is the data right? If we don't start with good data, we can't actually make decisions that we need to make. That is absolutely true in the context of prior authorization.
Great. Really important to get that foundation right. Anybody else, Daniel or Stefan, want to add to that?
Yeah, I would say for the other part of it, and it's maybe the uncomfortable part of it, is we know a lot of the data that's there is not clean and it's not right. Right. And so as we're thinking through from our perspective, sort of what we look at it, I agree with everything that Julie said, and I'll add on to it. It's, what Stefan was kind of talking about in his previous presentation of what is the right thing to do for the patient based off of evidence, and the historical data that's sitting there in that data lake is probably not the it's probably not the best thing, but I can almost guarantee you it's not the only thing that you should be looking at in terms of what should we do for the next patient coming down the line. I'm here in Orlando, actually, at Oracle's conference, and there was a patient story that they were talking about this morning during the keynote of all of the it was a mother actually talking about her son and all of the incorrect diagnoses that were sitting in various places of his medical chart at different provider groups in different EHR systems. And so even if we can get to a longitudinal health record for him, there's a lot of data in there that is deeply unhelpful and potentially misleading for thinking about the next patient with that set of considerations when we're doing. So it's taking a look at having a set of guardrails, regardless of the data that's in that lake and what's sort of been cleaned, and saying what's the right thing to do for this particular patient in this scenario. And to Stefan's point, I think where we both align is probably based off of some degree of medical evidence.
I think a corollary to what Danny said, which will be my 2-cent contribution to this, having seen versions of this problem in previous interop experiences, is having some context or perspective on provenance of data. If you're a payer and you're building a data asset, what are the various entry points into that data asset that your plan is using, right? What are you doing with your risk charts? What are you doing with, itemized bills that you get? And then sort of, I think, doing both a reconciliation, but then also doing some kind of honest accounting of like, we like a risk chart because it's comprehensive, but we like an itemized bill because it gives us the individual services, right? Sort of mapping the right data to the right use case and having a view into the entry points into your data warehouse as part of that.
Yeah, Danny, I might just add to that. I think it's a great call out because one of the things you sort of mentioned in that is both evidence-based practice, but really it gets back to how much of this really needs to be still structured and standardized. And I think sometimes what we hear or sort of assume is AI is going to mean we can only use unstructured data and we're going to be assured of its accuracy. And certainly there is no question that unstructured, being able to incorporate unstructured data is going to be incredibly valuable and open up use cases that we couldn't tackle before leveraging AI. But it does not negate the fact that, like to Danny's point, if you have incorrect diagnoses, the easiest way to clean those up is to actually have them codified. And having evidence-based practice actually matters in terms of framing it appropriately. That's particularly true, right, with EPA, what we're talking about now. But again, Anna, back to your foundation, this is all basics, right? You got to get the basics right to really make this meaningful.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to watch us mature through these two paradigms, one of which is we need to be 100% accurate because if you get this one thing wrong, a person's life is at stake, right? That's the stakes that we're dealing with here. So I would say that one paradigm is high stakes. We have to get it right. And then the second paradigm is that nothing is perfect, and not even brain science or neurosurgery is exact. You can ask them. They will say, it's not as exact as you think it is. So living in those two spaces, in order to get to that foundation, we all have to work together to reduce the burden on and the timeline that it's going to take to get us to a place so that we can put all these agents on top of our language model that we have. And it is more fruitful than we think. We just got to really dig into working together and doing this as a village. And so as I think about the impact of what AI can bring to healthcare, its possibility, we got a long ways to go with the foundation, but we're going to do it, and we're doing it together. But at least I'm recruiting all of you on the panel and all 130 of you online. And what do you guys think from a clinician's perspective as you're working with these clients? From my perspective, prior auth is really difficult. We navigate 18 different portals. We have to pull breast cancer results in a PDF attachment. There's not as much discrete data in healthcare as you think. How can AI move beyond how can it leapfrog over this problem for prior authorization? Let's say it's the perfect world and we've solved the foundation and now we want to leapfrog. I'm going to start with Danny on this one. Thoughts, Danny?
Yeah, I think, we've worked together in the past, and I think it's looking at and I know you're a human factors engineer by
I
part
am.
of your background, right?
Yes.
And so it's true. Stephen and Stefan actually both said it in their presentations in terms of, are we actually going to get to true improvement of a workflow on the other end of this or not? And if we set out to check the regulatory box for CMS 0057 and don't move beyond that, I think the answer to that will very likely be no for a vast majority of health plans. And so the question becomes is, can we actually add value to that workflow downstream? And there's a wide variety of different ways to do that from my perspective, but you have to do something to make it easier, right? So Annie, you kind of kicked this question off and the last one by saying we have 7,000 different portals we have to log into, right?
Yes.
Think through the concept as a health, there's quite a few health plan folks I recognize on the other end of this, and I know that many of you delegate services like high-tech radiology to an Evacor, or you delegate behavioral health reviews to a Magellan. Another group of you have had various conversations about which services are going to be included in the first rollout of this prior authorization API. If this just becomes one other submission point instead of one submission point for everything, we're not going to get there as an industry. We're not going to actually get to making that downstream experience better. And so is it better to have, 130 procedures that are fully CQL? Everyone can shut their eyes really tight and book an appointment, and they're going to get an approval back in, 25 seconds. Is it better to have 130 of those or take that same amount of money and do every single procedure that you might require authorization for inside of this? I mean, my perspective is the latter. I'm curious what the others think.
Really, Stefan?
So I think that is such an interesting and important question, and I completely agree. Stephen, Stefan, Dana, we've talked about this before. Of we have to prove this can be successful, and it has to have impact because we don't need a 19th portal, right, or a 19th workflow. And a lot of this starts with the how is it done today? And we can all acknowledge it is incredibly complex. And the best way to tackle it, right? We've seen pilots have really, from a technology perspective, been sort of tried and true. They work, but it's been really challenging to move and assist payers and providers to move from pilot to full implementation because of that complexity, because of choosing beyond that just sort of one thread to solve end to end. And I think that it's going to really take the entire community. I think back to, the high tech moving, I'm old enough to have documented on paper as a nurse and moving to electronic health records. And, it was done sort of chunk by chunk, piece by piece for the most part, right? You did CPOE and then you did all these other things. And so we have to be thoughtful about how we approach it. And we have to make sure we are creating a path to success because nobody wants to invest this much energy and time and just have something else that is also onerous. And so we need to have some significant early proof points and then expand. And I think there's a lot of value. Some of us have already had conversations around things like finding out the most common challenging pathways, the ways to demonstrate that success early. And I think I know that this is really sort of throwing in the AI flavor to that, and I think that's where AI can be leveraged as a path to have that impact. Is AI is not a solution, right? AI is a how to help get to success.
I think that's right. I wrote down three things based on what you just said, Julie, of like ways that I think AI can kind of turbocharge prior auth modernization. The first thing I wrote down has nothing to do with prior auth, but it does have everything to do with kind of how to think about dividing work, which is vibe coding, which is essentially using large language models to generate blocks of source code. So if there are ways to take that paradigm and apply it to prior auth, I'm not a clinician, so I don't want to go too far out over my skis about like where that might be. But the idea of kind of taking large intractable problems with multiple dependent steps, breaking them into pieces, and turning an AI loose on just one part and say like optimize this piece. And the AI will probably, you know, not get it right. Like some human will have to iterate over that. But the idea is if the robot kind of pushes you, like turbocharges that first 20% of the optimization or the improvement, then you saved yourself a ton of time. I think as a corollary to that, the second thing I wrote down is to accelerate experimentation. I feel like with prior auth, there's a real risk aversion and for good reason, but I think we're at a point now where the technology is so good that we can probably do some pilots and do some experiments and essentially say, okay, in any experiment we're going to design around an optimization or an improvement or a transformation of a part of prior auth, where can we use AI to accelerate that feedback loop? And then the third thing I wrote down is kind of keeping it to self-contained scenarios. So AIs work best when operating under like very clearly defined constraints, whether it's a clinical area, a care scenario, like a specialty, right? In the case of like Danny and Mai's product, right? Like individual policies, things like that, right? Just sort of saying, focus it on like just this thing. The more constraint you can give the AI, I think the less likely it is to get off track and misinterpret context or apply it incorrectly or not interpret an abbreviation correctly, that sort of thing.
One thing I might just jump in with, because I know Danny, we have talked about this, and Stefan, you're certainly aware. AI is a great opportunity also to do things that we don't do so well otherwise, right? I think that CQL is a great example of that, right? I mean, are you really going to get everything in CQL effectively? And I know we've had some conversations in the past to say it's great for what it does, but this is an opportunity to get the edges complete and actually sort of have it be more end-to-end comprehensive.
That's great, Julie. I really appreciate the comment. First of all, you are the first one probably to say vibe coding on a weedy on a weedy.
I don't know if I should be proud of that or not, but
I think you should. I think you should, because this is the point. Be curious. This is not 100% accuracy rate. That's why I was bringing up the two paradigms, because healthcare needs to change its culture and being its mindset of being exact the first time and figuring out ways and places where you don't have to be exact and you can have a lot of controls to check to see, oh, why wasn't it? Let's make that, let's tweak it. Okay, better this time, better next time. You'll get to 100% a lot faster. And I really appreciate the point that Danny was sharing around the ladder. He was saying that let's codify all the things, make the bot specialized, like you were saying, Stefan. So it's something that we're going to have to shift our mindsets on. And our next question is more related to where in the space of AI or in the prior auth workflow. By the way, Julie mentioned a point of light, like let's do it. Multicare has done it. It works. We've proven it works. So everybody needs to go out and start doing these experiments too. We're trying to recruit people to do it. And if you need help, let us know. We're here to share. We need more adopters in the world so that we can start making this right. Because if we do it as a village, we'll get to the 100% and we can live in both paradigms. So the next questions are on the details of the workflow and where we specifically think that AI has an opportunity to improve the workflow. I think, Stefan, you alluded to it being more specialized. So if you're going to put something into place, maybe around, excuse me, we started with one really hard auth, which was weight loss surgery, because there's so many variables to weight loss surgery. And maybe Danny, you can kind of speak to how that was a specialized intelligence run in order to get to approval or non-approval.
Yeah, I think that was where that approach that we took, I think we started with a hard one. The payers, Stefan talked in his previous session about numbers of indications and sub items and what have you. I think that particular payer's medical policy at the time had over 80 individual indications inside of it. And at that time, the technology that was sort of available to all of us was CQL. And so looking at doing that type of informatics work at that type of scale for one policy for one health plan, we did it, and it was expensive. And so, now I think we would go back and look at that opportunity as a better opportunity to say some of the, and even within that, out of 80 indications, I think we were maybe able to actually write CQL statements for a third to a half of them at max. And the reason being, and I'm not a clinician either, Julie is the only licensed clinician on the panel of the three of us at least. But I think looking at those, there's certain things in there that says an adult patient has a BMI of greater than this particular value. We can evaluate whether you're an adult, and that's date of birth. That's a very easy rule for us to do. We can look at, we can either look at a BMI that's already there, or we can do a very simple calculation evaluation expression to get that value. And sometimes we have to do unit conversions within all of that, and that's all well and good. That's for one of those 80 things. You start going through and you say, okay, there's another couple of them that have to deal with your diagnoses. There's another couple of them that have to deal with some conditions that you may or may not have. Those are all CQLable statements. Then we get into the problematic ones where we said, you've already tried and failed less invasive treatment. Okay. There is a way to get at CQL for some part of that, but not all of it, right? We can start to lay out what is an example of better treatment or less invasive treatment. We can look for some of those procedures having been completed as part of your chart. Oh, by the way, if those were performed outside of that hospital system, now we have a question of whether that data is actually even going to be there. So there is that question that we have to sort of to work through, but we can write some of it, but we really can't fully probably get at that particular indication with CQL alone, because the element of failure of those treatments is very patient specific and context specific, and likely is buried, to Julie's point. That part of it is going to be buried in unstructured data that isn't always very easy to go through and restructure. And so those are some elements, going back now, I think we would have had much more of an AI first approach for that particular use case than we did at the time. And I think we got some good value even with what we did at the time. But I think now we would go back and say the ability for AI to be a more complete coverage of that particular policy than we were able to do with a more structured approach is probably what we would do now.
I love that example. It's so good. You can apply that in many places. Julie or Stefan, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I love that, Danny, you said we would approach it a little bit differently now. I think that that's probably true for all of us as we've sort of gone on this journey together, that this is still rapidly changing and we can't ignore that fact. And every day we're getting better and better at getting faster, more accurate answers. And I think it's important to think about the electronic prior auth challenge as something that is still evolving, that we need those points of light, and we need to, as an industry, sort of say, this was our best understanding at the time, and the next round is going to get even better, and the next round is going to get even better. I think about this, it was not a focus on prior auth, but sort of a chart review use case that I was helping someone with around AI, where they said, one of the things that we've come to learn leveraging AI is we should always ask, what else do I need to know about this patient? Well, in that particular case, right, within the context of the question I was asking, it came up with, well, don't you know this is a veteran with burn pit exposure? Now, I'm never going to CQL that, ever, no matter what, right? And so I think that's just
policy. It's not in the policy. Yes.
Right. And so that's where you can have some aha moments of like, wow, this can blow this up and be beautiful. But that is one question, while we've also asked the necessary questions, right, around age or BMI or whatever those other things may be. But this is where AI shines, to say, what else do I need to know? And you might have something that says, aha, that changes everything about this clinical picture, that absolutely is going to impact the prior authorization review and approval process. And so I think we're still learning and evolving, and there's a lot of opportunity in that.
Oh, and another example of a question that you're never going to ask via, or maybe you wouldn't even think to ask, Julie, right? You're a nurse. Going through these, looking at these things, we've gone through some cases where we said, yeah, the patient looks like they probably need to be at an inpatient level of care, looking at acute authorizations like Stefan was talking about, right? It looks like they need to be at an inpatient level of care. That's what they're ordered for. This whole thing looks good. Let's move forward. And that's a case, right, where we actually looked at the manual process that came before it. We run a lot of our test cases on things that we already know the answer to. And we verified the answer to. And so that one, we were like, that one looks like it should go ahead and approve. And then we get to looking and comparing it to the other one, and that was denied. And that was a case that actually got turned around by manual review in less than 15 seconds as a denial. And why? The patient discharged against medical advice before they made it to the floor. Another question that you're very rarely going to see in anybody's medical policy per se. Another question that you're probably not going to ask via CQL, actually, another question that's way more expensive to ask via CQL and via AI than just a traditional good old-fashioned rules engine that can take a very simple if-then statement and move on. But that's another example maybe of a question that you, Julie, as a nurse would be like, you look at that chart for 1 second, that first cover page, discharge date is today, and they want an inpatient level of stay that ends on Friday. What are we doing? No. So there's another examples of a question you might not think to ask. Sorry, Stefan, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I had no notes. I really like what you just said. I think that the thing I'll just say to tie those two things together is just kind of transparently sharing those things when you find them and when you learn about them, and then just sort of asking the question of like, is this something that we think AI is even a good fit for? Or is this just, it falls into that boundary of like, this is something we always want to have a human involved in, right? We always talk about the human in the loop dial at Optum of like, where does the human need to be in the loop, like intimately involved? Where can we really pull the human almost entirely out of the equation? And just sort of, setting that dial at the right level and acknowledging that the right level in one care setting is probably not going to be the right level in a different care setting.
Well, and I think I might just tag onto that. I think it's a great call out of transparency is really important. One of the things that we do some experimenting and testing, clinical validation testing on is the idea of, if we just go out to an LLM portal and ask a question, do we get a different answer or the same answer as when we've actually sort of added some intelligence, some guardrails, some processing, some other things, because frankly, that answer is good enough in a lot of ways, but not for this use case. And so we need to make sure we're adding in the things that matter and then validating against the sort of the floor, and then what we would expect as Danny, I think you mentioned, you often match against what your manual process is today, right? So you know those outcomes. And so we're running it against multiple different metrics across the way, because we're not just meeting what the sort of the existing metrics are, but we're exceeding them. And we're not just sort of wrapping and white labeling something, we're actually adding value there.
Awesome. Thank you guys. I mean, you moderate yourself. I don't know if I'm just kidding. You're so great. This is so great. There is a question in the chat that actually I'd love to answer now because it's related to what we're talking about here. And Hannah asks, will there be a need to have an opt-out process for some process requests that just can't be handled via API? And that speaks to the human factor part that we're talking about. Where does the AI sit? How do you make sure that the process we create for this future can satisfy 80% of the use cases, and then there's a exit button that says old process or maybe old new enhanced process. I don't know what it is, but what are your guys' thoughts around that?
So I'm happy to jump in here because clinically, of course, I have strong opinions. And when you look at the research around AI specifically, right, there's a lot of research around leveraging AI, particularly in radiology, right, and whether or not humans still need to be in the loop, because if they do something like read X-rays, their accuracy rate compared to residents may actually be better in some studies than the residents themselves, right? So there's a lot of academic research in the medical community around when you might be able to leverage AI that may or may not really require a human in the loop. And if you dive into those studies collectively and as a whole, categorically, even when an AI at initial first pass may get a more accurate reading, there's a need for potential review. And I think that EPA is a great example of something that you always have to be able to interrupt, right? Whether it's the AMA example that Danny mentioned or some other example, there are always things that might be missed that require that critical thinking and that need that validation and opportunity to revise. We at Intersystems have a policy of humans always have to be available in the loop. And so we provide opportunities for that tracking and interruption. And I think that I can't say what the industry will look like 20 years from now, but I think it's absolutely essential today.
Yeah. I think the only thing I would add is I think that the straightforward answer to Hannah's question is probably yes. Will there be a need for an opt-out process? Yes, somehow, whether it's handled, to bring it back to Da Vinci, whether it's handled through CRD or whether it's handled through a brokered understanding between the provider and the payer. I think the two things you'll want to make sure you have in place as a corollary to that are, one, what are the conditions or circumstances under which an opt-out will happen, right? Is it initiated by the provider or the payer? And then sort of two, like have a really clearly well-defined path for, what is that experience going to be when an opt-out condition is triggered? If it's just going to be, and if you need to just shortcut right to, okay, it's two MDs need to get on the phone and just hash this out, right? Save yourself the time and just be like, we know this is where we're going to end up, right? Like let's just get here. And then maybe you do as part of a CPI thing, right? Continuous process improvement. Say, okay, well, we want to limit the amount of hours our MDs spend on the phone. Let's talk about macro, look at those rules, look at those processes. Can we change them? But, get to where you're gonna more than likely end up sooner rather than later.
For sure. And I think the last point from my perspective there would be very careful about what just can't means. If just can't is a clinical reason, like Stefan was talking about, I think that's fair. If just can't is we don't do home care authorizations via API because our source of truth system can't handle real-time access for length of stay considerations, I don't know if that's a good answer. The clinical one is a good answer. We don't know how to do length of stay calculations is a bad answer from what just can't means. And so I think there is an element of the more of those scenarios that as a health plan implementing a prior authorization API you introduce, the less and less valuable it's going to become from the downstream folks. And so if you can, my old boss used to say, does it pass the red face test? If you can get up on a panel like this and say it's just can't and here's why, and you can explain why without your face turning red, I think that's a good just can't. If it's maybe we can't really explain that one that without turning face red, I think that's a scenario where you're going to start eroding the value that the implementation is providing. Then you're going to start eroding the adoption because you've started to erode the trust in sort of what you've built.
Exactly it. That's exactly it. I just put my favorite quote from HIMSS 2025 was new technology plus old organization equals costly old organization. Because if you can't change the way you fundamentally work adopting EPA is changing your culture. It's a different way to think about the problem. And when we adopted it, we had different speed dial numbers that we called when we couldn't, when the API wasn't available or the data was like, we had different workflows than we did before. And so when we adopt something new like this, we have to really think about what's the culture it's going to take to get us there, because we will revert to what feels comfortable. That is what humans do. We also, group together. We like to be with people that make us feel comfortable. So ensuring that culture creates groups of people who feel comfortable with the technology is going to be really important in regards to what you're asking, Hannah. It's absolutely adoptable. It's just that just can't has to be weighted and have that curious mindset about why. My mother used to be like, if you ask me another why question, it's going to cost you $20. But in this world, I would say just keep asking that question all the time, all the time. All right, Stefan, anything else you want to add to the end of your question there?
No.
You're good? Okay.
No.
I'm going to move on to the next genre of information, which we've talked about all the tech, all this AI, and part of the foundation we were discussing is really about standards. In fact, Julie mentioned structured and standard. I think all of you have mentioned something about a standard, but where do you think standards have to be, and how critical do you think they are for this to really bring us to scale? With the mindset that we're going, we're not striving for perfection here. We're agile thinking. I'll start with Stefan first on this one.
I have a lot of conflicting thoughts on standards because I think that they give us really great starting points, and much in the way like AI kind of serves as an accelerant. I think a standard can also serve as an accelerant, but anyone of a certain background will remember this XKCD comic, which I will try to find at some point and drop in the chat, where essentially two people are talking and they're like, we have too many competing standards and we need to come up with one unifying standard. And then jump cut to like, okay, well now there's 13 standards instead of 12, or there's 15 standards instead of 14. And so I think what you end up with in healthcare and interoperability is just as businesses and teams apply those standards to their local understanding of their product and their customers, right? And we're not immune from this, right? Like you diverge your implementation from the standard and now you've created de facto like another one. So I feel like the way to address that head on is to kind of advocate for, like, figure out if your deviation can defend itself, right? To Danny's red face test, right? Can this thing you want to do justify itself? And do you have to run out of breath to defend it? Or is it really just like, it makes it easy for your business to achieve, milestone XYZ. And so it would really be great if the standard conveniently aligned with your priors. And then in scenarios where it can't, to the kind of broader conversations we're having about like transparency and trust, be like, well, why? why do I think this divergence needs to exist? And does my business need to re-examine how we're structuring our information, how we structure our process, how we build our products, right? We are going through a version of this within our qual where we're just sort of saying, look, there are ways in which our criteria structure diverges from the standard. There are ways where we'd like to see the standard change because we think that succinct, clear, unambiguous conveyance of evidence-based criteria is like vital. But then there's also ways where it's like, well, we've written this criteria this way for a long time. Do we need to re-examine how we write our criteria? Because this interoperable standard is where the industry is going. And we will not be able to just brute force push the industry one direction or another.
Great answer. Julie or Danny?
Yeah, I might jump in here too to say, you know, we've been at the standards thing for a long time, and I think to Stefan's point, you know, just adding another one doesn't help, but actually aligning and coalescing on a unified understanding is really, really helpful. And so, you know, I have to say, I don't know if I will retire and or die before the last V2 HL7 message is sent, right? I mean, you know, there's some of them that are really stuck, and there's some that just you know sort of were created and died on the vine. And I think that, you know, one of the helpful things is the fact that all of the new regulations and the new standards that are coming out for this type of work are all fire based. And so then you can get to, okay, we're gonna define it the same way, we're gonna exchange it the same way. And the reality is to Stefan's point, a lot of it isn't formatted in Fire today, but at least we have a goalpost now to aim towards, to work towards that alignment. AI can close many of those gaps. And so, you know, I think that this is an opportunity to say standards have their place, formatting has its place. The way we interoperate is dependent on agreed upon understanding of the way to do so and expectations on both sides. But then we also have this opportunity to lay on top of it some added intelligence in a way that can actually bring us further.
Well said. No notes.
Julie, all of the vendors that do ADT notifications all just like felt their like jaws clench. You were like,
Exactly.
they're like, I hope not. Not anytime soon.
I hope not. It's going to be around for the next 100
notification?
years. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. And I think as you think about standardization, the last point there is figuring out sort of where is standardization realistic and valuable, and where is it unrealistic and therefore more problematic in some cases than it is valuable. So I think, Stephanie, your presentation, you were talking about unifying and standardizing criteria if we can. We both probably align on a desire to have some element of that. And I think, you know, from MCG's perspective, we come in eyes wide open that it is purely unrealistic in all cases, right? There's just certain states that say you just have to use this thing, and maybe we just wrote it and we're trying to get ROI on it, or maybe we wrote it 25 years ago and it's just the way we do things either side of it. The other problem that we come at this with is looking at these standards even for burden reduction for CRD, DTR, and PAS. Sure, the way that maybe we talk between payers and providers can become standard, but we're not standardizing claims engines behind the scenes, right? We are not standardizing provider databases behind the scenes, network databases. We're not, you know, and I'm saying we, not MCG, but as the industry, right? We are not even standardizing benefit plan definition behind the scenes, right? And so there is going to be some scenarios where we will need to, it's hard for the standards to be flexible, right? And so within the construct of the standards, they need to have enough inside of them where, and there are even some gaps I think we all acknowledge that need to be worked out with even what we have right now to make sure that more elements are available. But thinking through, is there enough there that we can sort of abstract out our own internal complexities after requests hit those APIs? Is there enough there that we can do what we need to do with them? Is going to be part of the challenge.
Yeah, if we think about the marketplace, that is the United States capitalism. Variety means different cultures at each company, right? Different uniquely things that makes them marketable out there to choose from. I call this, in my world, this translates to cultural computing. Like, how can I get to 80% of a standard and then culturally take the rest of it so it makes them uniquely them and enable that? That's a new concept that I'm kind of noodling on, because when I go back and I talk to our engineers about implementing these standards, Danny, they're like, I can recycle 80% of the code consistently on these apps for APIs. And then there's the 10% that maybe AI can help me with. So it closes that gap. But there's still going to be 10% that a human in the loop has to do, because everybody culturally does it just slightly different. But that's what identifies them as an organization. And that is their, blood. It's their bloodline. So how do we create a standards environment that enables that capitalism in the marketplace, so that I, as a provider, can have many choices in the market to choose from? Okay, so we are getting close to time, and I would love to close with final words. Either what's your hope for the future, a piece of advice as we move forward with bringing EPA to life, and actually executing this. We've talked a lot about some of the details and the decision making that we've learned from over our experiences. So I'm going to go down the line here, start with Julie, then Danny, then Stefan, and then we'll close it out.
Thanks so much. So, it's been great being part of this panel, and certainly hearing Stephen earlier and then Stefan, and talking with all of you. I think that when I think about the next 6 months to 2 years of this space, I think one of the things I think about is really the quote you mentioned, Anna, of an old organization with new technology is just a costly old organization, that this is partially a technology problem, but this is largely a entire transformational engagement for everybody who's involved. And so when we think about doing this, we have to really approach it together. This is not something that anyone can do in isolation, and it really requires a perspective of partnership, whoever you're using, with vendors, with providers, with payers, in the work groups, all collaboratively, right? Talking about the transparency of our learnings along the way, because for this to be successful, we have to agree and have some common understanding and some common goals for clean data, for the workflows that are going to be involved, and for what success looks like. And then the only way we're truly going to get there is together, because this is not just technology. This is an all of us problem.
100% an all of us problem. And majority governance, data governance, culture. You got that right, Julie. All right, Danny, what are your thoughts?
I think hopes, I'll take the hopes for the future sort of side of it. I agree with what Julie said. I don't really have anything to add there, but from a hopes for the future perspective, I hope this works. And I think the advice that I would have is get your hands dirty in terms of what the manual process looks like today. It is prior authorization more than any other thing that I've done, in my career in various different stops. There is so much complexity. The only thing that I can get even all people in a payer organization, but certainly people in a payer and a provider organization to ever agree on is it depends. It depends what. Document the hell out of it, understand sort of all of the different, it's prior authorization has turned into a ball of yarn that's been batted around by a cat several different times. Several different cats in several different rooms several different times. And so the question becomes, can you successfully unravel what that ball of yarn looks like for at least your particular organization, so that you can actually make sure that all of this interoperability compliance stuff is actually working. Get your hands dirty with the way the manual process is done today.
Also highly recommend that. I had no idea that they were calling 6 people and waiting on hold for 9 minutes. Like I had no idea. You're like, what? You're suffering silently. Stop. All right, Stefan, bring us home.
I think the thought I would leave you all with, and Julie kind of touched upon this, but Annie, you've been circling it, and how you've been structuring these questions is that this process in the next few years is going to be as much about changes in culture and changes in attitude as it is about changes in technology and products and even workflows, because all those things are downstream of how our organizations make decisions and how we let go of the things that we're used to and that we're acclimated to, and take the risk of trying something new, knowing full well that sometimes when you try something new, it doesn't work. And the only way this is going to work, and I am here because I believe in the thing that Danny said, like I want this to work. I believe this has to work. And so the only way we all can make this work is if we let go of the side of the pool and take a swim and get our hands dirty, to try to mix metaphors. So I think the thing I would leave the audience with is, like, think about how you can get your organizations comfortable with change and comfortable with the fact that sometimes when you change things, they don't work, but that's not the end, it's the beginning. Create a sense of psychological safety, to borrow my IO psychology wife's favorite term. Help create a sense of psychological safety in your workplaces around like trying new stuff. Because it's the only way this is going to work.
Thank you so much, Stefan. Psychological safety, very important, very important. Got to make those
Yes.
triangles safe in all the environments. That's right. Love that. Thank you guys so much for what you shared. There's some questions in the chat. If you could answer them in text, that'd be great. But thank you so much for all the work you're contributing to advancing this forward, to helping others learn. And I'm inspired by this conversation, so I hope others are too along the line. And please put your gratitude in the chat to make sure they can hear your feedback as well, because we're fish swimming upstream and sometimes we get really tired. Yeah. we need some cheerleading every once in a while.
We need attaboys, as my friend who coaches Little League likes to say.
Yes, that they do that in my son's soccer team. Same thing. So thank you guys so much for all that you do, and thank you to Weedy for hosting us and having this conversation. So Michael, I'm going to hand it back to you, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Fantastic. Anna, thank you so much for moderating. Stefan, thank you for pitch hitting. Julie, Danny, thank you very much for being part of this fantastic panel. Folks, visit wedi.org for more information on our upcoming educational events. We have a ton, including our national conference taking place in the beginning of November in Washington, D.C. and Zoom. Once again, wedi.org. Have a fantastic rest of the day and a fantastic rest of the week.